Hi, I'm Angela, and this is the second video in a series I'm doing on living alone but being connected. And this video is on the purpose of getting into your community. So today I'm looking at two versions of community. Really, there's one version of community, but some of us are more physical, like face-to-face with community. Some of us are virtual. Some of us do a combination of virtual and physical. So you might not be physically able to be with a community, but you connect virtually because of the delight of technology. So today I'm looking at some of the overarching factors that influence any community that we go into. And this comes from some of the ancient requirements of being in a community. And as I look at those overarching factors, I'm going to address the purpose of getting into community, because there is a rising habit, pattern, response in our society to perhaps alienation, disconnection, to retract into our homes and be a Netflix bunny, as I shared with Caroline Jacobs. And one reason that Caroline and myself set up Living Your Magnificence, it's a group on Facebook, is every month we share topics about how to expand into your magnificence around your understanding of yourself through some spiritual tools and also just questions. And we also look at how to look at your relationships to groups and what that says about what's being brought up for you and how to expand yourself in a group environment. And also with Patty Oskvarek, Patty's an executive and leadership coach. So with Patty in building better relationships, we look at the nitty-gritty of what goes wrong in relationships and how to expand in the wrongness of things. Thanks. Hi, Maureen. And so if you've got situations as well, you can pop them in the chat, because I can expand on those with Patty or with Caroline in the groups, and try joining those groups for specific topics. Like with Patty, she works with executives in work environments, in corporate environments and government and organizations. I'm much more of a creative arts person and healing relationships person, so I'm not in the corporate world. But Patty and I had this interesting relationship about all the things that go wrong when you go into community, or family stuff that gets triggered when you go into community. And today I would like to look at the overarching factors that are being brought up today in this very changing time of our world, about what is the purpose of getting into community. If more of us are staying isolated because of physical reasons, like you might live away from your family, it's pretty hard to be with family if you're 3-4 hours drive away. And more of us are working a lot or getting into busyness. Even in traditional cultures now, they're getting modernized. So they're becoming workaholics because they can get more money to get more stuff. So that's a natural byproduct, is to be more in our virtual spaces. And as you can see in the virtual world, people can be quite unkind. So there's a reason for all of this happening. I want to go to some overarching themes around that so you can get some big picture perspectives on why this is happening now. Because the purpose of getting into community is to work out how to be better as a community. If anyone's noticed history over the last 1,000 or couple of thousands or many thousands of years, there's been a lot of conflict. It's not like conflict is new. So why do we care? Why do we bother? Why are we worried about conflict? Because we want something better. Do we know how that is, how that operates? No. And we also live in the shadow of thousands of years of families, or your family communities, or countries with communities of failure. And I come from a Mediterranean background, and they like to complain. So they usually take things that go wrong in a community or a village. If any of you come from a village, you may understand small country towns. They tend to generate the negative perspective on the community and complain. Complaining has become a cultural habit, and that's coming out on our social media. It's coming out in the news. The news like to not report the news, but complain or have opinions about things. So where is the news? And that some of us don't like the news because it's not really telling us what's going on, and it's hard to get the facts. And next video, I'm looking at the world as our family and why we get triggered by the news. Today, I'm looking at more the role of community from ancient times to present and what's actually going through a shift, because it's quite exciting from my point of view, and perhaps it can enlighten you to some different ways to look at when you go into a group context or when you go into a group situation. So last video I mentioned, I've got no shoes today, if anyone watched the last video where I kicked off my shoe by accident. And I thought, today's shoes off. So one of the reasons to go shoes off or jump into community is because from last video, I mentioned about owning your quirks, and a group or a community group will help you to own your quirks, even if you feel less or negative about your quirks or you think you're not enough. By forcing yourself or encouraging yourself or inspiring yourself to go into community, you're going to have to start to see where you feel less and try to be more, or be very trying. I said, like, be awkward. I was extremely socially awkward from, I don't know, birth. And I forced myself in my 20s to go into groups being socially awkward. It was still a panic situation for me. And even now I can go to a party and get anxiety. And I think that's a common situation. Other people are kind of like extroverts. So when we go into group, there's two general categories. I'm looking at different ways of looking at human beings as we go into groups. So generally you may know of extrovert versus introvert. So an introvert does not mean they necessarily want to hide. Introverts love groups too. It's just that they have a certain way of managing their energy, which requires a certain alone time. And you can experience that as you go into a group. What are your concerns about it? That's going to give you lots of clues about what are your needs if you're feeling like you need alone time. Other extroverts feed off groups, so they seem to be the life of the party, and that's perceived as successful. However, some of those extroverts are also drained by groups or don't feel satisfied on an intimate personal level. So there's always a plus and a minus to any kind of personality traits you have. So the purpose of getting into community from the dawn of time is that we're tribal human beings. We are not a human being that's born on a mountaintop and left to fend for ourselves. We're not human beings born in isolation. We're human beings born in a tribe or a family. Today we're more isolated families or nuclear families, but we still live as nuclear families in a community everywhere. We are born to be together. We're not isolated beings. And the purpose of getting into community is to understand what is possible from the group level. As an individual, I mentioned last time, as an individual, you may sort of go into your own bedroom and focus on how life is not good or you're not good. When you get to a group, you can take your issues to the group and they reflect back to you another way of looking at yourself or the problem that you're facing. They also might be living in a way that you can model. So the group is so valuable for the individual, always, has been forever. We're tribal human beings. So when you get into a group, what happens is you're being together allows a different consciousness or awareness or ability to overcome obstacles that's not possible when you're isolated. So still today, that's the ancient purpose of getting into community. It's still the same. It's always the same. That's not going to really change. What will change is how we get into community through virtual realms, and also our perceptions about how to relate will shift because we're using virtual technology rather than the physical body. So also the purpose of getting into community togetherness is to expand our energy. You can be in your bedroom really isolated, but once you get in a group, you have to sort of feel yourself expand, and that can be scary for some. And it can also be a way of growing and exploring, which is so exciting for humans. Every human is born to explore. We get shut down when we get isolated or told that we're not enough. So when you get to a group, you can expand into that part of your consciousness. I just wanted to share something from Maureen. She's shared that she's had a lung transplant, and the team, looking at groups, function in ego. And because of that, they've had that the lung transplant has had serious problems. And now her personal self has an attitude, but she's dependent on the team to keep her alive. My fear is, and thank you for sharing this, Maureen, because it's very valuable and important for us to learn from, as well as a big experience for you to go through. Maureen shares that her fear is, if I speak my mind, I lose my support group. So we often fear being kicked out of a group, or that the group will reject us. And she says that communicating with someone more powerful than you is overwhelming me. I'm not shy, but I am fearful. Does this relate to this? Yes, it does. You've shared for us, Maureen, what's happening with the ego. When we go into group situations, we have a perception of how things should be. And our society, unfortunately, has a lot of perceptions that have come from a long time, in this case around medical systems, or the individual in a medical system, how they should be treated or how they are perceived. So it's different to, say, another community group which has a different agenda. So when you get into a group, you don't have to, but there's a choice to see what's the agenda of the group. And I'm just going to share a strategy for you, Maureen, and we could perhaps look at that again if this doesn't make sense. So once you look at the agenda of that group, it's you can see their ego. It's coming from a medical system and perhaps authority, their perception that they know better. They also may see the person, I'm not saying this is for every medical client or patient, which is an interesting word. They may see that person as another person that they have to get through, or another number in the days of clients they have to address. So it's not just you that they have to address, but they have to think about the bigger group, and they have to move through with a certain time. If we look at traditional medicine, when you worked with a shaman, they never factored in, I've got thousands of people coming through, and there's a accounts department, and there's this clerical staff, and I have to get all the paperwork. They didn't care about that. They looked at you as a whole person. So that's one of the things, that's the agenda. In that agenda, it's very, like Maureen, you're sharing, that it's very minimizing of your self-power. How can I fight that? Once you understand where the ego is coming from, that's when you begin to look at the language you can use to get into it. If your fear is so strong, it can avoid looking at language. You can stay in the fear, and you can start to attack, which is normal. In tribal situations, we would attack when we feel threatened. And you're not shy, so your nature is to be more assertive and to go for what you want. But to be in the community or in that group, because it's not really a community based on harmony, it is a community based on certain people have an amount of power, and you have to accept that. You have to actually work much more around the fear you have and how to verbalize it in a simple manner without all the story or without attacking them, to make sure your needs get met. And in some ways, it's very hard if you've gone through a medical condition or you have an overly sensitive system. And I'm going to address this because one of the things I wanted to bring up today is that there is a large percentage of our population who are not just introverted, but they're highly sensitive, and they always have been. This is not a new phenomenon. So, Maureen, this may fall into some sort of category that you fall into. But when you're highly sensitive, the tendency is to go into extreme fear and disempowerment, and to be stuck there. And that is very important for a group. Whenever you're stuck, that is a crisis that you've got to resolve, because that's what your soul or your spirit, higher self, is bringing you to the group to resolve. And lungs as well can be a lot of sense of, I can never, a lot of grief about maybe this hasn't worked before and it's not going to happen now. And opening up to life, and a fear about opening up to it. So this has to be managed. The fear has to be managed. So I don't do that stuff alone. I usually work with someone to, I've always been the younger kid, so I went to someone for help. That was one benefit about being younger. I'd always go to, not usually a parent, but a sibling or some cousin or friend. And I've constantly done that. Because if you're in the fear, you can't really verbalize without a lot of excessive attack. And highly sensitive people, what they can do is withdraw. There's a beautiful book or a teacher on highly sensitive people. It's called The Highly Sensitive Person by Dr. Elaine Aron. And she says about 15% of our populations throughout history have been highly sensitive. So they are the more mystical types, the more artistic, the more empathic, extremely empathic. So everybody has empathy to a degree or a lesser degree. But the highly sensitives have high empathy, and sometimes to their detriment, often to their detriment, because they don't know how to assert their needs in a way that they feel like they can get met. Doesn't mean they can't get met, but the perception and the feeling in the body and the nervous system can be overwhelming. And when you're going through medical distress, you can get into that trap of the fear, which is why I would recommend to get a support person to then work with your language to get really clear. Because in the medical system, it comes from other hierarchical systems. And in Dr. Elaine Aron's book, she talks about there's another type of person in the society that's more like the warrior, the aggressive type. If we look at monkeys, there's the aggressor monkey. There's the extreme aggressor, who usually is the outcast of the tribe, and they have to be managed, and that's a small percent. And there's a more aggressive, assertive type that tends to be the king monkey. So she calls it in her book the king. And in ancient cultures, the more sensitive types, that 15%, were used as the artists and the advisors to the king to look at how to use empathy effectively. So the medical system is sort of more like something that the king would use as an auxiliary unit to assert his intent to control certain systems in the culture. So you then have to look at what's the language to say, this is what I see happening, this is what I need, without attacking them, but saying very clearly your needs. And if you get stuck in the fear, verbalizing can be extremely difficult. And seeing them as powerful, it also, what it does, if you're seeing this medical system or group who are working from ego as more powerful, what it does, it's saying that you have, through your no power to communicate. So you have to look at your language and see how it may actually express that you don't have agency. Now I use, I panic all the time. It's the way I was raised, not because of the way my parents treated me, but my personality is sensitive, not highly sensitive, but I'm sensitive. I fall in this 15% category. So I go into panic and I'd shut down communication. In fact, I'd go to my bedroom or just sort of go, I won't bother my parents because they'll get angry. So it's very engendered in a lot of us, that behaviour that Maureen's sharing, where we feel powerless. However, to change it, we need to start taking steps, get support to start expressing, to get your needs met. Otherwise, it's always about attacking from a place of lack. And that's where groups are extremely important, because remember, tribal societies needed us to work together, but we had to acknowledge that there was 15% or so that they were more sensitive, or the touchy-feely types, the nurturing types that didn't maybe need to be so active. And then, of course, there is a large part that were more social. And I wanted to give you another reference that I found really helpful to understand different personality types in groups. It's called the Dunedin Study. In New Zealand, Dunedin, Dunedin. I'll put a link. I don't have the link for the documentary, but they found basically 5 personality types. And there is personality types of people who are extremely aggressive, others that are more quiet but are withdrawing types. And we're seeing them a lot with more of the gamer type personality that we see in our culture now. Gamers withdraw into their rooms. And in the documentary that the Dunedin Study created, it was a 3-part documentary. they actually have certain people, not in gaming per se, but just a certain personality type that would perhaps use the computer and stay in their room, never leaving the house. So it can result in extreme behaviours. That is accessible to us now because of technology. In previous civilizations, we have not had technology. So if you had that personality trait, it couldn't develop to that extreme. Also, now we have other social problems. So people who are in the more aggressive personality spectrum, and I think that they're roughly about those two personality types, the ones that are introverted and more passive but don't like to socialise, and the ones that are more aggressive and antisocial, that's roughly about in the 15% range. Then there's another part of the population that are the go-getters, the pioneers, the leaders, the take charge types. And they love adrenaline and they love to invent and move forward. So they tend to be the more extroverted and the life of the party, and they tend to bounce back when life hits them with problems. We tend to idolize those people in this modern culture. I was thinking about the Marvel movies, how now we have these, the Avengers. They're groups of superheroes. So we're even seeing in our movies now lots of tribal stuff, lots of new groups. And some of those superheroes have a lot of human flaws or quirks, as I like to call them. And you think of Captain America, he's a very small body, but then he's beefed up. And then you have, I forgot the guy that's from Watchmen, but you have some people that are really the extreme empath, and they have heightened sensitivity and ability, psychic abilities or telepathic abilities, or they can walk into different dimensions. So you have in the Avengers and in Watchmen lots of different spectrums of the more physically robust versus the more empathy-based type. What I think is not really encouraged in those films is just your ordinary person. I mean, like Spider-Man is just your everyday kid that turns into a superhero and he's a nerd and he's great. But what about the ordinary person that's like serving bread at a bakery, or making bed, or delivering FedEx? You know, what about those people? We don't really have a place to celebrate that in our community at the moment. And I see people really not wanting to look at that because it's not glamorous. If you can look at your personality type and see how maybe you've been shunted in your life, you can see how maybe there's parts of yourself that you're not feeling so, that you're so useful in society. And that's the danger I see, where we're not really having TV shows or movies that look at the really boring parts of life, because those jobs where people just trudge along and make things happen, they're really important. Like if I go to the shop down the road and I smile at someone, that's really my day. That's a big influence on my day. Those relationships where you get your coffee, all those things are really, really valuable human relationships, or the bus driver. They're very important. They make us feel connected, because you can walk around and feel quite isolated in our world. But those everyday relationships are really, really important. So that's where I see we don't emphasize the Avengers and all that are great, because it's looking at those latent abilities of the more empathic type versus the more assertive type or robust physically type. But where are we seeing the everyday person celebrated or even understood and appreciated? The other personality type from the Dunedin study is the more social type. And they're the people that relatively like move through social circuits. That's the largest amount. It's about 40%. They're kind of not the leader. They get on, they're socially dynamic. They don't need to stand out in the crowd. They're a good team player. They're very mobile, like they can do it, multitask and do several roles, be a parent, do community stuff. They're the supporters, the person you can talk to. They just run around and get and help everybody feel like things are getting done. They're the doers. And these people are the largest part. So they're the people I think often that don't get recognised as well. They're the people that are just so dedicated parents. They make sure that things move through in society. They're not looking for attention. They're not trying to push their agenda. And they look out for others as well. So they make sure people get included. So that's a really interesting amount from the Dunedin study. That's the largest group, somewhere around 40%. My numbers are not exactly accurate. When I finish the video, I'll go back to my notes and see if I can find those percentages for the personality types. But it was fascinating to me because I found that as much as we idolize the sort of extreme types in our society, the kind of largest part, which are more able to be able to integrate, we sort of take those for granted and we think that's normal. And then we look at other groups as atypical, or the more assertive, aggressive type as somehow we idolize them, but we're jealous of them, or we try to pull them down. And we don't want everybody to be the same. So the other thing I wanted to finish with the purpose of getting into community is if we have the king or the more entrepreneurial leader type, we have the antisocial aggressive type, we have the ones that are more introverted and isolated and depressive type or melancholy, we have the sort of 40% that are just the more socially mobile and like to move around. There's a fifth category I'll have to review, but they're more the watchers and the analysers of society and reflectors. So they're very reflective people. They're still social, and I think they're about 10%, but they're not as social as the majority of that 40%. So they reflect, they will input, and they'll give analytical perspective on things, and we need those people. So that's what the Dunedin study found. That's just one way. It's 5 personality types that they found over 40 years of researching one group of 1,000 individuals. And it's coming up to 48 years, actually. And they looked at people who ended up in jail as well from that group of 1,000 people from New Zealand, Dunedin. The research is based in Dunedin. So one thing I would like to look at is that as a society, if we can acknowledge in a community that we've got these different personality types, we have to start looking at how to manage them, because the aggressive or the socially isolated, introverted, or the leader, that those are not going away. They're innate to what we have now. Maybe in 1,000 years things will be different. But what Dr. Elaine Aron is saying is that there were always the sort of more dominant types, and there was always an aggressive energy that was perhaps channeled into the military or criminal element, and there was always the more sensitive and empathic types. We have these types in our world. The Dunedin study, what they offer in a lot of different researchers have used that material now from the study, everything from the biological researchers to the psychological to the sociological. So extreme neuroscience, a lot of people are using that research. And all of them come up with this question: how can we come together to use each other's energies in a proactive manner? We can't expect everybody to be the normal or the 40%. We don't want that. It's never been like that. We're not normal. We're not that. We're not normal. Even the people in the 40% so-called socially mobile and interactive and team players, we're not all like that. And even those people have quirks. Even those people have things that they need to express or share or develop or grow, and maybe even challenge. Certainly challenge if you're here on Earth. So what are we going to do to help each other to come together? And that's the main purpose for getting into community, is to ask that question. If you're in virtual communities online, what you can start to do is to say, how can I bring a better level of discourse, or speak in a way that doesn't hurt and offend, not be like completely shut down my honesty. Maureen shared a really important piece today about learning how to communicate your needs in a situation where you feel you can't, because it's so important to start speaking up. But how do we do it in a way we get heard? And I don't mean just respectfully. Yes, respect, but sometimes it's more about getting clear. Because when you're clear and you're not coming from a place of lack, people naturally start to respect you more naturally. For example, you won't be, if I ran to the shop and say, I'm sorry, I'm running late, can you just give me that now? And I'm in a rush, but I say it to them why I'm being pushy or why I have that urgency, rather than just sort of blasting in and being a negative Momo. And actually start verbalizing. People respond. They actually say, oh, I want to help you. So rather than actually saying we've got these groups in society, how do we eradicate some element, or how do we normalize everyone, which is never going to happen anyway? What do we do to come together? And the group brain is more productive than the individual brain. So I'll finish with this point. When you have your brain and you're stuck in your bedroom thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do with my life? That's one brain. When you go into a community or a group brain, even two people, your brains start to connect and new ideas come. They reflect back to you and you get another perspective of how to approach your situation or your perception of yourself. It's instant. That has been measured with psychology as well. It's called the copacetic thinking, or the right brain to right brain, right hemisphere to right hemisphere, copacetic thinking. How do we get that as a positive aspect of groups? How do we start to talk in a manner where we're sharing and looking for ways to look at the self differently? And that, a lot of it goes into how do you start communicating so you can own your quirks, you can share authentically in a manner that's not saying, oh, I feel less, or I feel a victim, or I feel not enough, but just to say, oh, I had this situation and I'm looking for something. What do you do? Asking questions, looking at a way to communicate in groups online is going to be a huge part of how we build a better way of coming together. And we need to start looking online in groups how to communicate more proactively in a way to make us have a higher level of discourse. I hear that a lot. How do we have a higher level of discourse? We can actually do that. We can create that intent to do that when you go online, whenever you're sharing, thinking about, well, if I say this, how will it impact people? Not from the point of view you don't want to say anything because you might be judged, because that's often what I'm finding now. If I go to social groups on media, oh, don't want to put that there because they might think blah, blah, blah of me. But putting it into your social group with the intent to ask for support or ask for questions. Asking questions can be the way to start engagement of discourse. And if someone doesn't understand your situation, how to tell them, actually, that's not what I meant. This is what I'm looking for. Similar to what Maureen was sharing with us before, getting clear of what you're looking for from the group when you're going to post online is a first step before you post. Don't just react and post. Think about it, feel about it. And one of the strategies I've found is that sometimes I think, yeah, what do I want to share before I type? I don't even have the phone or the device with me. I'm just walking around or thinking, and then, oh, that's what I want, that's what I want. And then I go to the phone and it just comes out naturally. But I'm not with my device and typing and thinking at the same time, because that tends to sort of miss this opportunity to contemplate of actually what do I want from the group, what do I want to share, and what can I create with the group that I would like to offer to the group, which is a more proactive way of looking at communication. So if you have any ideas around communicating, thanks, that's great. If you have ideas about any ways of communicating at that high level of discourse, I would love you to put that in the chat, because it's something I hear in the social medias, but I don't see people actually describing what they mean by that. They say, oh, we have to talk better. That's good. Well, how does that look like? What would be a way to talk at a higher level, or even just share without an agenda? Maureen's just given a great example, to appeal to them as my knight in shining armor. So to create this persona like we see in the Marvel comics, if you've got a superhero persona, you don't need one, you can have it. And here it's a knight in shining armor to see how to be a champion for what you want. If you're wanting to contribute to the community and have it grow to have a better level of discourse, what is that level of discourse you would love to experience? Inspire people, and that can be a way to change the element of the group, of why it's so good to come together, because it's when we come together that our group brains can achieve more than we can by ourselves. So thanks for joining, and next time I'll be away this coming Sunday in America, Monday in Australia, the 16th, 17th. And then when I'm back on the 24th of June, it's right after our solstice period, summer solstice in the Northern Hemisphere, and winter solstice in the southern hemisphere. So I'm going to look at all the world is family, and that's why they trigger you. Yes, so we're going to look at conflict in the world and how it may upset you and what you can do and what it actually reflects about how we're going to come together as a world if we want to. Do we want to? It seems like there's a lot of people that don't. But I think in our hearts as a consciousness, as a species, we're looking for something different. We don't all want to come together, but we're looking for something different. And that's the first key. So I'll look at that. And then on the following day, on the 25th in Australia, I've got 2 talks with Coach Patty Oskvarek and spiritual healer Carolyn Jacobs. And we're looking at things again to look at building your strengths, being yourself in a community. And so please, I've got the links in the description. Join us in the groups and you can find out about those Facebook Lives that we're sharing as well. Thanks, everyone.